May 7, 1943. Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard, Hawaii. The afternoon sun hammered down on the corrugated steel roofs of Dry Dock No. 3, turning the enclosed space into a furnace that swallowed sound and breath alike. Inside, beneath the skeletal ribs of the destroyer USS Fletcher undergoing repairs, Captain Harold Morrison stood absolutely still, his uniform already dark with perspiration, staring at something that should not exist. 24 feet of polished steel lay horizontal across reinforced sawhorses, its surface still bearing the barnacles and coral scrapes from its violent journey through 3,000 miles of Pacific Ocean. The torpedo's nose cone, dented from impact but fundamentally intact, caught the harsh work lights and threw them back in fractured patterns across the concrete floor. Someone had stenciled provisional markings along its body in white paint, clinical measurements and reference points that seemed absurdly inadequate for what this weapon represented. Morrison could hear the rhythmic clang of shipfitters working 2 decks above, the pneumatic hiss of riveting guns, the ordinary sounds of a naval base at war. But here, in this pool of artificial light, surrounded by a small circle of officers whose faces registered varying degrees of disbelief, the ordinary world felt very far away. This was not a piece of wreckage. This was not debris salvaged from some forgotten engagement in the Coral Sea or the waters off Guadalcanal. This was a revelation, cold and complete, delivered in the form of Japanese engineering that rewrote every calculation the United States Navy had made about the Pacific War. Lieutenant Commander James Whitaker, the ordnance specialist who had supervised the torpedo's recovery and transport, stood with a manila folder pressed against his chest like a shield. He had not slept properly in 4 days, not since the moment the salvage team radioed back their preliminary findings from the waters off Cape Esperance. Inside that folder were photographs, measurements, chemical analyses, and a series of conclusions that still felt impossible despite the physical evidence lying before them. Whitaker had spent 12 years studying torpedo technology, had written his doctoral thesis on propulsion systems at MIT, had consulted for the Bureau of Ordnance on the Mark 14 torpedo program. Nothing in that education, nothing in the confident assessments of American naval superiority he had absorbed and repeated throughout his career, had prepared him for what Japanese engineers had achieved years before the first shot was fired at Pearl Harbor. The torpedo resting on those sawhorses was not an incremental improvement over existing designs. It was a categorical leap forward, a weapon that operated on principles American naval architects had dismissed as impractical or impossible. And it had been hunting American ships across the Pacific for nearly 2 years before anyone in the United States Navy understood what they were facing. Morrison finally moved, circling the torpedo slowly, his hands clasped behind his back in an unconscious gesture of restraint. He was 46 years old, a career officer who had commanded destroyers in the Atlantic before the war and cruisers in the Pacific after it. He had seen action at Midway, at the Eastern Solomons, at Cape Esperance, where this particular weapon had been fired in anger before malfunctioning and sinking to the seafloor instead of tearing through the hull of an American destroyer. He had written after-action reports describing torpedo attacks of inexplicable range and power, had read intelligence summaries that attributed Japanese success to luck or American error rather than superior technology. Like most of his colleagues, Morrison had absorbed the comfortable narrative that American industrial might and engineering excellence would inevitably prevail over an enemy depicted as imitative and inferior. The torpedo before him obliterated that narrative with the cold eloquence of mathematics and metallurgy. This was the Type 93 torpedo, though American intelligence would eventually designate it the Long Lance, a name that carried a grudging respect absent from earlier assessments. This was the weapon that had savaged Allied cruisers at the Battle of the Java Sea, that had sunk the USS Juno with such violence that few of her crew survived the initial explosion, that had turned night battles in the Solomon Islands into nightmares of fire and confusion. And until this moment, until this salvaged example lay intact and available for dissection, American naval commanders had not fully understood what was killing their ships. The war in the Pacific had begun with catastrophic surprise, but that surprise was supposed to be temporary. a function of unpreparedness rather than fundamental inequality. Pearl Harbor was a tactical disaster born from complacency and failed intelligence, but the ships sunk there were obsolete battleships, relics of an earlier age of naval warfare. The carriers, the modern vessels that would decide the Pacific conflict, had been absent that December morning, and American industrial capacity would replace losses and build new fleets faster than any enemy could match. Or so the narrative ran, repeated in newspapers and newsreels, in congressional testimony and classified briefings. The United States possessed superior resources, superior industrial organization, superior technological innovation. American workers could outproduce any rival. American engineers could solve any technical problem. American fighting men, equipped with the products of that industry and innovation, would inevitably triumph over authoritarianism and aggression. These were articles of faith, assumptions built into every strategic calculation and operational plan. The torpedo lying in dry dock number 3 was evidence that faith alone was insufficient, that the enemy possessed capabilities American planners had failed to anticipate or respect. Whitaker opened his folder, though he no longer needed to consult the numbers written there. "Length, 29 feet, 6 inches, he said, his voice flat and precise, giving nothing away. "Diameter, 24 inches. Weight, 6,175 pounds. Warhead, 1,080 pounds of Type 97 explosive." He paused, glancing up to ensure Morrison was listening. "Range at 48 knots, 22,000 yards. Range at 36 knots, 35,000 yards. Propulsion. Oxygen-enriched compressed air driving a wet heater engine." The numbers landed in the stifling heat of the dry dock like physical objects, dense and undeniable. Morrison's expression did not change, but his jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the skin. 22,000 yards at high speed, over 12 miles. The American Mark 15 torpedo, the standard destroyer weapon, had an effective range of 6,000 yards at 45 knots, one-third the performance of the Japanese weapon. Worse, the Mark 14 submarine torpedo, upon which so much American strategic planning depended, had proven catastrophically unreliable, its magnetic exploders failing, its contact detonators crumpling on impact, its depth-keeping erratic. American submariners were hunting Japanese shipping with weapons that often failed to explode, while Japanese destroyers and cruisers carried torpedoes that could strike from distances American commanders thought represented safety. "Oxygen propulsion," Morrison said finally, tasting the words. "They're running torpedoes on pure oxygen." It was not a question, but Whitaker nodded anyway. "Compressed to 2,000 psi in a reinforced steel flask," he confirmed. "Mixed with kerosene in a combustion chamber driving a piston engine. No compressed air, no nitrogen, so virtually no bubble wake. The weapon is almost impossible to spot until impact." He flipped through several pages in his folder, found a photograph of the torpedo's midsection cut away to reveal the intricate machinery inside. "We knew they were using oxygen propulsion theoretically. Intelligence reports mentioned it, but we assumed it was too dangerous, too prone to catastrophic failure. Oxygen under high pressure is incredibly volatile. One spark, one imperfection in the seals, and the entire weapon would detonate, probably taking the launching vessel with it." He looked up, meeting Morrison's eyes. "We were wrong. They solved the engineering problems. They've been deploying these weapons since 1935. 1935. The date hung in the air like an accusation. While American naval architects were refining incremental improvements to compressed air torpedoes, Japanese engineers had already achieved a breakthrough that transformed naval warfare. While American planners assured themselves of technological superiority, Japanese warships were being equipped with weapons that could dominate night actions and long-range engagements. 8 years before American captains stood in this dry dock examining the evidence, Japanese naval doctrine had evolved around a weapon American doctrine did not believe existed. The implications spiraled outward, touching every naval engagement of the past 18 months, recontextualizing defeats and near disasters, suggesting that American ships had been fighting at a categorical disadvantage even when their crews performed with courage and skill. Morrison walked to the torpedo's tail section, where the contra-rotating propellers emerged from the drive shaft housing. The engineering was exquisite, the metalwork precise and elegant, each component fitted with tolerances that spoke to industrial sophistication and manufacturing discipline. He thought of the Mark 14 torpedo, plagued by defects and failures, the product of American contractors working to specifications that had never been adequately tested because peacetime budgets did not allow for live fire exercises. He thought of the Mark 6 magnetic exploder, a device so secret that submarine commanders were not allowed to examine or adjust it. A device that failed with such regularity that submariners had begun running their torpedoes on contact detonation only, reducing effectiveness and increasing the chances of dewed impacts. American torpedoes were supposed to represent the cutting edge of naval technology, the product of the world's most advanced industrial economy. Yet here was proof that Japanese engineering had surpassed American capabilities years before the war began, that the comfortable assumptions about enemy inferiority were propaganda rather than analysis. The emotional weight of this realization was complex and corrosive. Morrison had spent his career in a navy that understood itself as preeminent, the heir to British naval tradition, the guardian of oceanic dominance that underpinned American security and prosperity. The battleship represented the ultimate expression of that dominance, steel and firepower projected across vast distances, an assertion of power that could only be challenged by equivalent industrial might. Even after Pearl Harbor, even after the demonstration that aircraft carriers had superseded battleships as the primary instruments of naval warfare, the underlying assumption of American superiority remained intact. The Navy had been caught unprepared, its fleet dispersed or obsolete, its leadership too confident and complacent. But preparation and leadership could be corrected, and American material advantages would assert themselves as war production accelerated. Except the torpedo lying before Morrison suggested that material advantage was insufficient without intellectual humility. Without the willingness to study enemy capabilities rather than dismiss them, without the recognition that engineering excellence was not an American birthright, but a hard-won achievement that required constant innovation and testing. Whitaker was speaking again, his voice threaded with a frustration he no longer attempted to conceal. "We've tested every component we could safely examine without destroying the weapon," he said. "The oxygen flask is a masterpiece of metallurgy. The seals are made from a rubber compound we haven't been able to identify yet. The engine achieves thermal efficiency we thought was theoretical, and the guidance system, the gyroscope assembly, is more sophisticated than anything in our inventory." He closed the folder, holding it against his chest again. "Sir, this torpedo represents at least 5 years of development work, probably longer. It's not a prototype. It's not experimental. They've manufactured these weapons in quantity, deployed them across their entire surface fleet, and used them to devastating effect. And we had no idea. We had intelligence reports, we had interrogations of prisoners, we had evidence from damaged ships. And we dismissed it all because we couldn't believe the Japanese were capable of this level of engineering." The words landed like an indictment, and Morrison felt the full weight of institutional failure pressing down across his shoulders. Intelligence failures were understandable, products of incomplete information and deliberate enemy secrecy. But this was something deeper. A failure of imagination and respect, an unwillingness to credit the enemy with capabilities that contradicted preferred narratives. American naval officers had been trained to think of Japanese industry as derivative and inferior, Japanese engineering as imitative rather than innovative. Those assumptions had been comfortable and reassuring, had allowed American commanders to enter the Pacific War confident that material superiority would compensate for numerical inferiority and strategic surprise. But comfort and reassurance were luxuries purchased at the cost of accurate understanding, and that cost was measured in ships sunk and sailors drowned, in battles lost or narrowly won despite catastrophic disadvantages. The symbolic weight of the torpedo extended beyond its technical specifications into the realm of ideology and self-conception. This was not merely a weapon. It was a mirror reflecting back an image of American assumptions that revealed their inadequacy. The United States had entered the Second World War as an arsenal of democracy, marshaling industrial might to defend freedom against totalitarian aggression. That narrative was powerful and largely true, but it carried embedded within it a presumption of superiority that distorted strategic thinking. Democracy was not merely morally superior to fascism. It was assumed to produce superior technology, superior organization, superior fighting spirit. American workers, free rather than coerced, would outproduce German and Japanese workers laboring under authoritarian regimes. American engineers, educated in universities rather than regimented technical schools, would innovate more effectively than their enemy counterparts. American fighting men, motivated by genuine belief in their cause rather than propaganda and compulsion, would prevail when material conditions were equal. These were the foundational myths of American war-making, and they contained enough truth to be dangerous, enough correspondence with reality to discourage skeptical examination. But the torpedo contradicted those myths at their foundation. Japanese engineers had produced a weapon superior to anything in the American arsenal, had solved technical problems American experts had declared impractical, had achieved performance characteristics that violated American assumptions about what was possible. And they had done so not in the pressure of wartime emergency, but years before, in a sustained program of research and development that demonstrated institutional capability and intellectual sophistication. This was not the product of chance or luck. This was the fruit of systematic effort, of engineering discipline and manufacturing quality control, of an industrial base that American planners had underestimated and intelligence analysts had misunderstood. The uncomfortable implication was that authoritarian regimes could achieve technical excellence, that propaganda about enemy inferiority was comforting delusion rather than accurate assessment, that winning the war would require more than industrial capacity and moral righteousness. Morrison turned away from the torpedo, facing the circle of officers who had accompanied him to this examination. Most were ordnance specialists and engineering officers, men whose careers had been devoted to naval technology and who now confronted evidence of their own inadequacy. Their faces showed varying degrees of shock and anger, the emotional signature of certainty collapsing beneath the weight of contradictory evidence. "How many of these weapons do we estimate they have?" Morrison asked, his voice carefully neutral. Commander Robert Chen, the intelligence liaison, consulted a leather-bound notebook before responding. "Estimates are preliminary and uncertain, sir. Based on observed attack patterns and captured documents, we believe the Japanese Navy has manufactured at least 2,000 Type 93 torpedoes since 1935. Their heavy cruisers carry 16 to 20. Their destroyers carry 8 to 16. Almost every major surface combatant in their fleet is equipped with these weapons." He paused, letting the numbers sink in. "And they've used them with considerable tactical sophistication. Night attacks at long range, coordinated launches from multiple ships, deliberate targeting of capital vessels. At the Battle of Savo Island, at Tassafaronga, at numerous smaller engagements, these torpedoes achieved results far beyond what our doctrine predicted was possible." Savo Island. The name carried its own weight of grief and institutional humiliation. August 9, 1942, less than a year previous, when a Japanese force of cruisers and destroyers had surprised American and Australian warships guarding the Guadalcanal landings, had torn through the Allied formation in a night action of stunning violence, had sunk 4 heavy cruisers and killed over 1,000 sailors before withdrawing into the darkness. The battle had been a catastrophe of tactics and intelligence, but it had also been a demonstration of Japanese night-fighting capability built around the Type 93 torpedo. American ships had been hit from ranges they thought represented safety, struck by weapons they never saw approaching, ripped apart by warheads that carried twice the explosive power of American torpedoes. The post-battle analysis had focused on failures of radar deployment and command coordination, on the inadequacy of American night optics, and the superior training of Japanese lookouts. But underlying those tactical failures was the strategic failure to understand what weapons the enemy possessed, what capabilities Japanese engineers had achieved, while American planners assured themselves of inevitable superiority. "We need to change our tactics immediately," Morrison said, his voice hardening with decision. "Every ship in the fleet needs to understand what they're facing. Maximum engagement ranges need to be revised. Night action doctrine needs to be completely rewritten. And we need to accelerate our own torpedo development program, because right now we're fighting with weapons that are categorically inferior to what the enemy possesses. He looked at Whitaker. How long until you can produce a complete technical analysis? Something we can distribute to every commanding officer in the Pacific Fleet? Whitaker glanced at his colleagues, received slight nods of confirmation. 2 weeks for a preliminary report, sir. 6 weeks for comprehensive analysis with recommendations for countermeasures. But, sir, understanding the weapon and producing something equivalent are very different challenges. This torpedo represents years of development work. We can't duplicate it quickly even if we wanted to. The metallurgy alone requires capabilities we don't currently possess. Morrison nodded, accepting the limitation without comment. The war would not wait for American industry to catch up, would not pause while engineers reverse-engineered Japanese achievements. American ships would continue sailing into night actions against an enemy equipped with superior torpedoes, would continue suffering casualties from weapons they could not see approaching, would continue fighting at a disadvantage that strategy and courage could only partially overcome. But understanding the disadvantage was itself valuable, allowed for tactical adjustments and doctrinal revisions that might reduce casualties and increase effectiveness. Knowledge was not salvation, but it was better than ignorance, better than the comfortable assumptions that had cost so many lives already. And perhaps, Morrison thought with a bitterness he did not express, perhaps this revelation would introduce a humility into American planning that had been absent before. A recognition that the enemy possessed capabilities that demanded respect rather than dismissal. The afternoon stretched toward evening, the heat in the dry dock becoming almost unbearable as the sun angled through the high windows and baked the steel walls. The officers dispersed slowly, returning to their duties with the weight of new knowledge pressing down on their shoulders. Morrison remained, standing alone beside the torpedo, studying its sleek form and elegant engineering. Somewhere in Japan, in a naval laboratory or manufacturing facility he could not name or locate, engineers had achieved this. They had solved problems American experts had declared unsolvable, had built weapons that redefined the parameters of naval warfare, had done so years before anyone in the United States Navy understood what was happening. That achievement was not diminished by the moral character of the regime those engineers served, was not negated by the aggression and atrocity that characterized Japanese military conduct. Technical excellence existed independent of political virtue, and denying enemy capability because of moral disapproval was a path to defeat. The symbolic object that would carry through this narrative, the recurring element that represented the collision between American assumptions and Pacific reality, was the torpedo itself, not merely as a weapon but as an artifact of humility, a steel rebuke to complacency and cultural superiority. Every time American commanders planned operations in the Pacific, they would now need to factor in the Long Lance's capabilities, would need to respect the range and power of Japanese surface forces, would need to acknowledge that the enemy possessed technical sophistication equal or superior to their own. The torpedo was a constant reminder that wars were not won by righteousness alone, that industrial might was insufficient without intellectual rigor, that the comfortable narratives of inevitable American triumph were dangerous delusions that cost lives and prolonged conflict. The torpedo that Captain Morrison examined in May 1943 was the culmination of a development program that began in the late 1920s when the Imperial Japanese Navy confronted a strategic problem that American planners did not face. Japan was a resource-poor island nation dependent on oceanic trade routes for survival, facing potential enemies, Britain and the United States, who possessed larger fleets and greater industrial capacity. Japanese naval doctrine could not rely on achieving numerical superiority in any future conflict. Instead, Japanese strategists needed force multipliers, technological or tactical innovations that would allow smaller forces to defeat larger ones, that would provide decisive advantages in critical engagements. The Type 93 torpedo emerged from this strategic necessity, from the recognition that conventional approaches to naval warfare would leave Japan perpetually inferior to wealthier rivals. The technical challenge was formidable, Existing torpedo designs used compressed air as their oxidizer, mixing nitrogen and oxygen with fuel to create combustion that drove piston engines. But nitrogen was inert, contributed nothing to combustion, and occupied space within the torpedo body that could otherwise be used for fuel or warhead. The nitrogen also produced a visible bubble wake that betrayed the torpedo's track, allowing target ships to maneuver away from danger. If nitrogen could be eliminated, if pure oxygen could be used as the oxidizer, torpedoes could achieve dramatically longer ranges, higher speeds, and invisible approach trajectories. The problem was that oxygen under high pressure was extraordinarily dangerous, prone to spontaneous combustion if contaminated by organic material or exposed to sparks from mechanical friction. Several navies, including the United States and Britain, had experimented with oxygen propulsion but abandoned the research as impractical and hazardous. Japanese engineers, working at the Imperial Japanese Navy Technical Department's facility in Kure, persisted where others had abandoned the effort. They developed specialized steel alloys for the oxygen flasks that resisted corrosion and stress fractures. They created rubber seals from synthetic compounds that did not degrade when exposed to pure oxygen. They designed ignition systems that prevented sparking and contamination. They built safety interlocks that would shut down the engine if pressure or temperature readings indicated dangerous conditions. And they tested relentlessly, conducting hundreds of live-fire exercises, accepting failures and casualties during development to produce a weapon that could be safely deployed in combat conditions. By 1935, the Type 93 torpedo was operational, and Japanese warships began receiving the weapons that would define their tactical doctrine for the coming war. The development of the Long Lance was not an isolated achievement, but part of a broader program of naval innovation that included superior optical equipment for night fighting, better damage control procedures, more effective anti-aircraft shells, and tactical doctrines that emphasized aggressive night actions and coordinated attacks. Japanese naval officers studied American and British capabilities with obsessive attention to detail, identifying weaknesses and developing strategies to exploit them. They recognized that American radar technology, while primitive in the early war years, represented a future threat to Japanese night-fighting advantages. They understood that American industrial capacity would eventually produce overwhelming numerical superiority if the war dragged on for years. Their strategic solution was to seek decisive early victories through superior technology and training, to inflict such catastrophic losses that American political will to continue the war would collapse. The Long Lance torpedo was central to this strategy, the weapon that would allow Japanese cruisers and destroyers to devastate enemy formations in night actions where American technological advantages like radar and numbers were reduced or negated. American naval planners, working under very different strategic assumptions, did not feel the same pressure to achieve breakthrough innovations in torpedo technology. The United States faced no existential threat from enemy naval forces, possessed industrial capacity sufficient to build whatever fleet structure seemed necessary, and operated under the assumption that American engineering was inherently superior to potential rivals. The Bureau of Ordnance, responsible for torpedo development, focused on incremental improvements to existing designs rather than revolutionary new approaches. The Mark 14 torpedo, introduced in the early 1930s, was supposed to represent advanced capability, incorporating a magnetic exploder that would detonate beneath enemy ships, breaking their keels without needing direct impact. But the Mark 14 was never adequately tested in realistic conditions because Depression-era budgets did not allow for expenditure of expensive torpedoes in live-fire exercises. The magnetic exploder was so secret that submarine commanders were forbidden from adjusting or examining it, even when evidence mounted that it rarely worked correctly. And when war came, American submariners discovered that their primary weapon was catastrophically unreliable, failed to explode more than half the time, and represented an institutional failure of testing and oversight that cost strategic opportunities and American lives. The contrast between American and Japanese torpedo development illuminated broader differences in military culture and institutional learning. The Japanese Navy, operating under resource constraints and facing strategic imperatives that demanded innovation, invested in breakthrough technologies and tested them rigorously, When failures occurred during development, they were studied and overcome through engineering discipline and persistent refinement. The resulting weapons were reliable and effective, used with tactical sophistication that reflected years of doctrinal development and training. The American Navy, operating under assumptions of inevitable superiority and peacetime budget constraints, invested in incremental improvements to existing technologies and skimped on testing to save money. When war revealed the inadequacies of American torpedoes, the institutional response was slow and defensive, with ordnance officials insisting that the problems were operator error rather than design flaws, delaying corrections that cost lives and prolonged the submarine campaign against Japanese shipping. These institutional differences were not products of national character or cultural superiority, but reflections of strategic circumstances and leadership decisions. Japanese naval officers recognized that their country's survival in a future war depended on achieving qualitative superiority where quantitative parity was impossible. That recognition drove innovation and created institutional pressures to test and refine weapons until they worked reliably. American naval officers, confident in their country's industrial capacity and operating under peacetime political constraints that emphasized cost savings over combat effectiveness, allowed institutional complacency to undermine weapons development and testing. The result was a situation where American submariners entered combat with torpedoes that often failed, while Japanese surface forces possessed torpedoes that performed beyond anything American planners thought possible. The strategic implications were profound and long-lasting. American submarines equipped with unreliable torpedoes struggled to interdict Japanese shipping during the critical early years of the Pacific War. Opportunities to sink Japanese carriers at Midway were lost because torpedoes failed to explode. Patrol after patrol returned with reports of dewed impacts and missed opportunities. Japanese merchant ships continued delivering oil and raw materials from Southeast Asia to support the Japanese war machine because American submarines could not reliably sink them. Meanwhile, Japanese destroyers and cruisers used their long-lance torpedoes with devastating effectiveness, sinking American cruisers at Savo Island and Tassafaronga, threatening American carriers at the Eastern Solomons, forcing American commanders to avoid night actions where Japanese advantages were greatest. The torpedo imbalance shaped the strategic evolution of the Pacific War, delayed American victory, and cost thousands of lives that might have been saved if American weapons had been adequately tested before combat. Morrison understood these implications as he stood in the dry dock that May afternoon, though he could not have articulated all of them. What he felt was a visceral recognition of institutional failure, a knowledge that the enemy had outthought and out-engineered the United States Navy in a critical area of military technology. That recognition was uncomfortable and humiliating, violated the self-image of American superiority that had been cultivated throughout his career. But it was also liberating, in a strange way, because it replaced comfortable delusion with accurate understanding. The war would still need to be won, Japanese aggression would still need to be defeated, but victory would require humility and learning rather than presumption and complacency. The long-lance torpedo was a teacher, its lessons written in steel and mathematics, demanding that American officers respect enemy capability and work with. Relentless focus to overcome disadvantages that courage alone could not erase. The emotional journey of understanding what the long lance represented followed a familiar pattern among officers who encountered the weapon's specifications for the first time. Initial reactions ranged from disbelief to anger, defensive assertions that the reports must be exaggerated or that Japanese manufacturing quality could not sustain such advanced weapons in quantity. These defensive reactions reflected psychological necessity as much as rational analysis. Accepting that the enemy possessed categorically superior weapons required confronting the possibility that American strategic planning was fundamentally flawed, that the comfortable narratives of inevitable triumph were propaganda rather than analysis. But as the evidence accumulated, as salvaged torpedoes were examined and tested, as after-action reports documented attacks from ranges that American doctrine insisted were impossible, defensive disbelief gave way to grim acceptance and determination to adapt. Lieutenant Commander. Whitaker experienced this emotional evolution in compressed form during the first 72 hours after the torpedo was recovered from the waters off Cape Esperance. He had been skeptical of the initial reports radioed by the salvage team, had assumed that measurements were flawed or that the weapon was some experimental prototype that did not represent standard Japanese capability. But as the torpedo was transported to Pearl Harbor, as preliminary examinations confirmed the presence of oxygen propulsion and measured the weapon's range capabilities, skepticism collapsed beneath the weight of physical evidence. Whitaker spent sleepless nights reviewing technical drawings and test data, comparing Japanese achievements to American capabilities, calculating the strategic implications of the performance gap. The more he learned, the more evident it became that American naval officers had been fighting at a profound disadvantage, that victories achieved had often depended on luck or Japanese errors, rather than American superiority. The anger that followed this realization was directed not at the Japanese, engineers who had created the Long Lance, but at the American institutions that had allowed complacency to undermine weapons development. Whitaker had written his dissertation on torpedo propulsion systems, had studied the theoretical literature, had known that oxygen propulsion offered dramatic performance advantages. But he had absorbed the institutional consensus that such systems were too dangerous for operational deployment, had accepted without adequate skepticism the assumption that American engineering approaches were superior to speculative alternatives. Now he confronted evidence that the consensus had been wrong, that theoretical advantages could be converted into practical weapons through sustained effort and engineering discipline. And he felt complicit in the institutional failures that had sent American sailors into combat with inadequate weapons, felt the weight of professional responsibility for not challenging comfortable assumptions with more vigor. Captain. Morrison's emotional journey was shaped by command, responsibility, and strategic perspective. He had been at Cape Esperance, had commanded the destroyer Aaron Ward during the night action in October 1942 when Japanese cruisers and destroyers engaged American forces protecting the Guadalcanal supply lines. His ship had survived the engagement, but 2 American destroyers had been sunk and a heavy cruiser badly damaged, hit by torpedoes that seemed to come from impossible ranges, that tore through hulls with explosive power far beyond what American intelligence predicted. Morrison had written an after-action report describing torpedo tracks observed from distances that exceeded the range of American weapons by factors of 2 or 3. That report had been filed and summarized, but no one had followed up with urgent inquiries or crash programs to understand what the Japanese possessed. The bureaucratic machinery of naval intelligence and weapons development had ground slowly forward, accumulating evidence without synthesizing it into actionable conclusions, allowing American ships to continue fighting at a disadvantage that might have been corrected with more urgency and institutional focus. Now, standing beside the salvaged torpedo, Morrison felt the cumulative weight of those months of inadequate response, felt the anger and frustration of recognizing that institutional failures had cost lives, but he also felt the burden of command, the recognition that anger was useless without action, that his responsibility now was to ensure that every commanding officer in the Pacific Fleet understood what they faced and adjusted tactics accordingly. The knowledge that would come from examining this torpedo needed to be disseminated immediately, incorporated into doctrine and training, transformed into operational procedures that reduced vulnerability and saved lives. That was the only redemption available for past failures, the only way to honor the sailors who had died without understanding what was killing them. The emotional contrast between expectation and reality extended beyond individual officers to encompass broader cultural assumptions about American technological prowess. The United States had entered the Second World War confident in its industrial superiority, convinced that assembly line production and engineering innovation would overwhelm Axis powers through sheer material abundance. The Liberty Ship program was producing cargo vessels faster than German submarines could sink them. Aircraft factories were churning out fighters and bombers in quantities that would blacken European skies and reduce Japanese cities to ash. Tank production was accelerating to support Soviet forces and equip American armored divisions. This was the arsenal of democracy in full mobilization. the practical demonstration that free societies could outproduce totalitarian rivals when survival depended on industrial output. But the long-lance torpedo complicated this triumphalist narrative by demonstrating that industrial abundance was insufficient without technological excellence. The United States could build more torpedoes than Japan, could equip submarines and destroyers faster than Japanese shipyards could construct new hulls. But if those American torpedoes were inferior in range, speed, and reliability, if they failed to explode half the time while Japanese weapons performed with deadly consistency, then numerical superiority was squandered through qualitative inadequacy. The war would still be won through American industrial might, but victory would be delayed and casualties multiplied by failures of engineering and institutional learning that propaganda could not erase. The uncomfortable truth was that abundance alone was not enough. That winning required not just more weapons, but better weapons. Not just greater production, but superior quality. Not just confidence, but humility sufficient to learn from enemies and correct institutional failures. This emotional reckoning with reality occurred across multiple levels of the Navy hierarchy. During the months following the torpedoes, recovery and analysis, flag officers receiving detailed technical reports experienced the shock of learning that their strategic assumptions were built on faulty intelligence. Destroyer captains absorbed tactical briefings that revolutionized their understanding of night actions and engagement ranges. Submarine commanders reading about the Long Lance's capabilities felt bitter. Recognition that their Japanese counterparts possessed weapons far superior to the Mark 14 torpedoes that failed with such regularity. And enlisted sailors reading summaries in fleet newspapers or hearing scuttlebutt from ordnance specialists felt the unsettling knowledge that they had been fighting at a disadvantage that no one had explained or prepared them for. Yet within this collective emotional trauma, there emerged also a kind of respect, grudging but genuine, for Japanese engineering achievement. The Long Lance was not a lucky accident or a propaganda fabrication. It was a real weapon, exquisitely designed and manufactured with precision that demanded acknowledgement. Japanese engineers had solved problems American experts declared unsolvable, had created something that worked reliably under the stresses of combat, had done so years before anyone in the United States Navy understood what they were facing. That achievement was not diminished by the moral bankruptcy of the regime Japanese engineers served, was not negated by the atrocities committed by Japanese military forces across Asia and the Pacific. Technical excellence existed independent of political virtue, and recognizing enemy capability was not tantamount to condoning enemy actions. It was simply accurate assessment, the foundation for effective strategy and realistic planning. Morrison came to embody this grudging respect during the weeks following his examination of the torpedo. He ordered copies of Whitaker's technical analysis distributed to every commanding officer in his squadron, added detailed tactical briefings to training exercises, revised operational procedures to account for the Long Lance's range and power. But he also requested that a cross-section of the torpedo be preserved and displayed at the Pacific Fleet headquarters, a permanent reminder of the dangers of complacency and the necessity of respecting enemy capabilities. The torpedo would serve not as a trophy but as a cautionary artifact, a steel memorial to the sailors who had died without understanding what was killing them, a teacher whose lessons needed to be learned and relearned by every generation of naval officers. The transformation of American naval tactics following the revelation of the Long Lance's capabilities was gradual but comprehensive, touching every aspect of surface warfare in the Pacific. The most immediate change involved engagement ranges and night action doctrine. Prior to understanding the Long Lance's specifications, American destroyers and cruisers were instructed to close to ranges of 6,000 to 8,000 yards during torpedo actions, distances that matched American weapon capabilities and allowed for effective gunfire support. But if Japanese torpedoes could strike from 20,000 yards, closing to what had been considered attack range meant entering a killing zone where American ships were vulnerable before they could deliver effective attacks. Tactical doctrine needed to be rewritten to account for this asymmetry, to develop engagement protocols that minimized exposure to Long Lance attacks while maximizing American advantages in radar and gunfire. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the South Pacific Force, received Whitaker's technical analysis in late May 1943 and immediately convened a conference of his destroyer squadron commanders to revise tactical procedures. The discussions were contentious and uncomfortable, filled with arguments about how American forces could fight effectively when Japanese surface forces possessed such dramatic advantages in torpedo warfare. Some officers advocated avoiding night actions altogether, relying instead on air power and submarine attacks to interdict Japanese forces. Others argued for aggressive tactics that closed ranges quickly, minimizing the time Japanese forces would have to launch torpedo spreads before American gunfire could suppress them. Still others suggested developing new technologies, radar-directed gunfire and improved night optics, that might offset the long Lance's advantages through superior detection and engagement capabilities. The compromise that emerged from these discussions reflected pragmatic recognition that American forces could not avoid night actions entirely, but needed to fight them with new awareness of Japanese capabilities. Destroyer formations would operate with greater spacing to reduce vulnerability to torpedo spreads, would maintain higher speeds during approaches to increase maneuverability, would use radar to detect Japanese forces at maximum range and attempt to engage before entering the Long Lance's most effective attack envelope. Cruiser squadrons would provide supporting fire from greater distances, using their superior gun ranges to suppress Japanese formations while destroyers maneuvered for close attacks. And all commanders were instructed to expect torpedo attacks from ranges previously thought safe, to watch for the telltale signs of incoming weapons, and to maneuver aggressively the moment attack was suspected. These tactical revisions represented institutional learning purchased at terrible cost, the translation of hard-won combat experience and salvaged enemy technology into operational procedures that might save lives. But they also represented acknowledgement of limitations, recognition that American forces would continue fighting at a disadvantage in certain conditions, that courage and determination could not entirely compensate for inferior weapons. The emotional weight of this acknowledgement was heavy, particularly for career officers who had spent decades in a Navy that understood itself as preeminent. To accept that American ships would avoid certain types of engagements because the enemy possessed superior weapons, to revise doctrine around the necessity of minimizing exposure to Japanese torpedoes, was to surrender the comfortable illusion of inevitable superiority and embrace a more complex and uncomfortable reality. Meanwhile, parallel efforts were underway to improve American torpedo capabilities. Though these efforts faced institutional resistance and technical challenges that delayed meaningful improvements for years, the Bureau of Ordnance, responsible for torpedo development and production, initially resisted acknowledging the severity of the Mark 14's failures, attributing problems to operator error or inadequate maintenance rather than design flaws. This defensive institutional reaction delayed corrections and infuriated submarine commanders who were risking their lives with weapons that often failed. Not until late 1943, after sustained pressure from fleet commanders and mounting evidence of systemic problems, did the Bureau finally authorize comprehensive redesigns of the magnetic exploder and contact detonator mechanisms. Even then, implementing fixes required remanufacturing thousands of torpedoes and distributing them across the Pacific theater, a process that consumed months while American submarines continued hunting with unreliable weapons. The effort to develop an American oxygen-propelled torpedo faced different but equally frustrating obstacles. Engineers at the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport, Rhode Island, began studying captured Long Lance components in mid-1943, attempting to reverse engineer Japanese achievements and adapt them to American manufacturing capabilities. But the technical challenges were formidable. The specialized steel alloys used in Japanese oxygen flasks were not readily available from American mills and required development of new manufacturing processes. The synthetic rubber compounds used in Japanese seals could not be easily replicated, and American alternatives tended to degrade when exposed to pure oxygen under high pressure. And the safety protocols necessary to handle pure oxygen during torpedo loading and maintenance were far more complex than existing procedures for compressed air weapons, requiring extensive training and specialized equipment. More fundamentally, American strategic priorities did not emphasize oxygen torpedo development with the same urgency that Japanese strategic necessity had demanded a decade earlier. By mid-1943, American forces were winning the war in the Pacific through air superiority and submarine attrition of Japanese merchant shipping, not through surface actions where the long lance provided decisive advantages. American industrial capacity was producing ships and aircraft faster than Japanese forces could sink them. The tide of war was turning through accumulation of material advantage rather than technological breakthrough. Under these circumstances, investing resources in developing an oxygen-propelled torpedo that might not be ready for combat until 1945 or 1946 seemed less urgent than accelerating production of existing weapons and focusing on technologies like radar and proximity fuses that provided immediate battlefield advantages. The emotional valence of this decision was complex and morally ambiguous. On one level, it represented strategic wisdom, the recognition that wars are won through effective allocation of limited resources rather than pursuit of every possible technological improvement. American engineers could study the long lance, could learn from Japanese achievements, could incorporate lessons into future weapons development. But they did not need to replicate Japanese capabilities immediately because American strategic advantages lay elsewhere. On another level, however, the decision reflected a kind of complacency, a return to comfortable assumptions about American superiority once the initial shock of Japanese achievement had faded. The long lance had demonstrated that the enemy possessed engineering excellence equal or superior to American capabilities in critical areas. That demonstration should have prompted sustained institutional introspection and commitment to matching or exceeding enemy innovations. Instead, after initial revisions to tactics and doctrine, American weapons development returned to incremental improvements and established priorities, treating the long lance as an anomaly rather than a fundamental challenge to institutional assumptions. This tension between learning and complacency, between the humility demanded by accurate assessment of enemy capability and the confidence required to prosecute a global war effectively, was never fully resolved. American naval officers absorbed the lessons of the long lance, revised tactics to account for its capabilities, and fought more effectively as a result. But they did not fundamentally transform their understanding of American technological superiority, did not question whether other comfortable assumptions might be equally unfounded. The torpedo remained an isolated example, its lessons compartmentalized rather than generalized, its challenge to institutional thinking contained rather than transformative. And in that containment lay both pragmatic wisdom and missed opportunity, both effective adaptation and failure of imagination. The broader context of American technological development during the Second World War illuminated both the strengths and limitations of the industrial mobilization that ultimately secured victory. The United States possessed genuine advantages in mass production, standardization, and logistical organization that allowed for rapid expansion of military capability once peacetime constraints were removed. Liberty ships were produced using modular construction techniques that reduced build times from months to weeks, creating a merchant fleet that sustained global supply lines despite heavy submarine losses. The B-29 Superfortress bomber represented achievement of strategic bombing capability that no other nation matched during the war years, combining range, payload, and technological sophistication in a weapon system that could strike Japanese cities from bases beyond the reach of enemy fighters. Radar technology, developed initially by British scientists but refined and mass-produced by American industry, provided tactical advantages in air combat, naval gunnery, and early warning detection that proved decisive across multiple theaters. But these achievements coexisted with failures and inadequacies that propaganda and triumphalist narratives often obscured. American tanks were generally inferior to German designs, less well-armed and armored than Panthers and Tigers, compensating through numerical superiority and better logistical support rather than qualitative excellence. American artillery was effective and abundant, but not technically superior to German equivalents. American small arms were reliable but conventional, offering no particular advantages over enemy weapons. And in the specific case of torpedoes, American designs were catastrophically inferior to Japanese weapons, remaining so throughout most of the war despite crash programs to correct deficiencies. The pattern suggested that American technological advantages were real but selective, concentrated in areas like radar and aviation, where American industrial strengths and research institutions could be effectively leveraged, less evident in areas like armor and torpedoes, where enemy forces had invested sustained effort and achieved breakthrough innovations. The symbolic significance of the long lance, viewed from this broader perspective, was its role as a corrective to triumphalist narratives that attributed Allied victory solely to American material superiority. The war was indeed won through material advantage, through the ability to produce more ships and planes and tanks than the Axis powers could destroy, through industrial capacity that overwhelmed enemy forces, through sheer accumulation of hardware. But material advantage alone was insufficient. Victory required effective doctrine and tactics, competent leadership and strategic planning, technological innovation in critical areas where advantage could be decisive. And it required humility sufficient to study enemy capabilities honestly, to acknowledge when the enemy possessed superior weapons or techniques, to adapt rather than cling to comfortable assumptions about inevitable superiority. The torpedo lying in Dry Dock 3 embodied this lesson in steel and mathematics. Its elegant form, a permanent rebuke to complacency. Morrison understood this symbolism, even if he could not fully articulate it, felt the weight of the torpedo's teaching pressing against institutional resistance and defensive psychology. The weapon was not merely a technical artifact to be studied and countered. It was a mirror reflecting American failures of imagination and respect. A teacher whose lessons extended far beyond tactics and engineering into the realm of strategic culture and institutional learning. And like all effective teachers, it was unforgiving of error. Its lessons written in the names of ships sunk and sailors drowned, in battles lost or won at terrible cost because American commanders had not understood what they faced. Whitaker's technical analysis, completed in early June and distributed throughout the Pacific Fleet, was comprehensive and unsparing in its assessment. The report documented every aspect of the Long Lance's design and performance, compared Japanese achievements to American capabilities, calculated the tactical implications for various engagement scenarios. But it also included a section, unusual for a technical document, on institutional lessons and strategic culture. Whitaker wrote with barely contained frustration about the failures of intelligence analysis that had dismissed evidence of Japanese capabilities, about the peacetime budget constraints that had prevented adequate testing of American weapons, about the complacency that had allowed inferior torpedoes to be deployed without adequate quality control. His conclusion was stark. The Type 93 torpedo represents achievement by Japanese engineers of capabilities American experts declared impossible. This achievement demands recognition that enemy forces possess technical sophistication equal or superior to our own in certain critical areas. Future weapons development must proceed from accurate assessment of enemy capabilities rather than comfortable assumptions about American superiority. The cost of complacency is measured in American lives. The emotional force of this conclusion resonated through the Navy hierarchy, touched admirals and captains who had lost ships to weapons they did not understand, submarine commanders who had fired torpedoes that failed while enemy vessels escaped unharmed. But it also touched enlisted sailors who read summaries of the report and understood for the first time why battles had been lost, why friends had died, why the confident predictions of easy victory had proven so catastrophically wrong. The Long Lance was no longer an abstraction or an intelligence report easily dismissed. It was real, its specifications documented and verified, its implications unavoidable. And that reality demanded changes in tactics and doctrine, in training and weapons development, in the fundamental culture of how the Navy understood itself and its enemies. Yet even as these changes were implemented, even as tactical revisions and improved torpedoes began appearing in the fleet, there remained an undertow of resistance, a subtle pressure to minimize the significance of Japanese achievement and return to comfortable narratives of American superiority. Public information officers writing for newspapers and magazines emphasized American advances in radar and aviation, mentioned Japanese capabilities only to highlight their ultimate defeat, framed enemy success as temporary and anomalous rather than products of sustained engineering excellence. Newsreels showed Japanese forces in retreat, Japanese cities burning under B-29 raids, American Marines raising flags on conquered islands. The narrative of inevitable victory through material abundance reasserted itself, obscuring the more complex truth that victory was hard-won and costly, purchased through blood and adaptation rather than delivered by inherent superiority. Morrison watched this reassertion of triumphalist narrative with mixed feelings. He understood its necessity for morale and public support, recognized that democracies at war required confident narratives to sustain commitment and sacrifice. But he also felt the danger in narratives that diverged too far from reality, that discouraged honest assessment and critical analysis. The Long Lance had been a shock precisely because American commanders had believed their own propaganda, had accepted comfortable assumptions without subjecting them to rigorous scrutiny. That mistake could not be allowed to repeat, could not be permitted to metastasize into institutional culture that valued reassurance over accuracy. The torpedo needed to remain present in American naval consciousness, not as a symbol of defeat but as a reminder of humility's necessity, as evidence that enemies could achieve excellence and that respect for enemy capability was prerequisite for effective strategy. The human cost of underestimating Japanese capabilities was calculable but difficult to fully comprehend, spread across dozens of engagements throughout the Pacific theater. At the Battle of the Java Sea in February 1942, the Long Lance torpedoes fired by Japanese cruisers and destroyers had torn through a combined Dutch, British, and American force, sinking 5 Allied warships and killing over 2,000 sailors. The Allied commanders in that battle had not understood what weapons they faced, had maneuvered as if Japanese torpedoes possessed ranges comparable to their own, had paid with their ships and lives for that miscalculation. At Savo Island in August 1942, Japanese cruisers equipped with Long Lance torpedoes had surprised American and Australian forces guarding Guadalcanal, had sunk 4 heavy cruisers in a night action that lasted barely 30 minutes, had killed over 1,000 Allied sailors before withdrawing into darkness. American commanders had known a Japanese force was approaching, had radar contact and warnings from coast watchers, but had not appreciated the range and power of the torpedoes Japanese ships carried. At Tassafaronga in November 1942, Japanese destroyers on a supply run to Guadalcanal had encountered an American cruiser force and, though outnumbered and outgunned, had launched a coordinated torpedo attack that sank 1 heavy cruiser and badly damaged 3 others. American commanders had achieved tactical surprise, had opened fire first and scored hits, but Japanese destroyers had launched their Long Lance torpedoes before being driven off, and those torpedoes had found their targets minutes later. Striking from distances, American commanders thought represented safety. The battle had been considered an American victory because Japanese transports were turned back, but the cost in damaged and sunken cruisers was disproportionate, another demonstration that Japanese surface forces possessed capabilities. American doctrine did not account. 4. Each of these engagements represented not just tactical defeats or costly victories, but failures of intelligence and institutional learning. The evidence of Japanese torpedo capabilities had been accumulating since the war's beginning, visible in after-action reports and damage analyses, mentioned in interrogations of prisoners and captured documents. But that evidence had been dismissed or minimized, explained away through assumptions about Japanese inferiority, or attributed to luck and circumstance rather than systematic enemy advantage. The institutional mechanisms that should have synthesized this evidence into actionable intelligence had failed, grinding slowly forward through bureaucratic processes while American ships continued sailing into battle unprepared for what they would face. Morrison had known some of the officers who died at Savo Island, had served with them earlier in his career, had shared wardrooms and watches, had developed friendships that war had severed. Reading casualty lists in the months after that battle, Seeing familiar names among the dead had been an experience of loss compounded by rage at the institutional failures that made those deaths preventable. If American intelligence had properly assessed Japanese torpedo capabilities, if tactical doctrine had been revised to account for enemy weapons, if commanding officers had understood what ranges Japanese forces could attack from, would those ships have been lost? Would those officers and sailors have died? The counterfactuals were unanswerable and therefore torturous. Invitations to guilt and recrimination that Morrison had to push aside to continue functioning. But they also sharpened his determination that future operations would not repeat past mistakes, that the lessons written in blood and steel would be learned and incorporated into doctrine that protected American lives. The sailors who served on ships that survived long lance attacks carried their own burdens of trauma and knowledge. They had felt the concussive shock of torpedoes striking nearby vessels, had watched sister ships explode and burn, had pulled survivors from oil-slicked water while knowing that their own ship might be next, and they had done so without understanding what was killing them. Without knowing that enemy weapons could strike from distances their officers insisted were safe. Without the psychological preparation that comes from accurate threat assessment. The revelations about the Long Lance's capabilities, when they finally filtered down through fleet newsletters and tactical briefings, brought a kind of bitter vindication, an explanation for experiences that had seemed inexplicable, but also renewed fear about what future engagements might bring. If the Navy had been wrong about Japanese torpedoes, what else might it be wrong about? What other comfortable assumptions might prove catastrophically false? This erosion of institutional confidence was both healthy and dangerous, a necessary corrective to complacency, but also a potential source of paralysis and demoralization. Morrison and other commanders worked to channel the emotional energy of revelation into productive adaptation rather than destructive doubt. The point was not to lose faith in American capability, but to gain realistic understanding of enemy capability, to fight with eyes open rather than clouded by propaganda and assumption. American forces were still winning the war, still advancing across the Pacific island by island, still sinking Japanese shipping and destroying Japanese air power. But victory required acknowledging that the enemy possessed certain advantages, certain areas of excellence that demanded respect and tactical accommodation. The Long Lance was one such advantage, now understood and accounted for. No longer a source of inexplicable casualties, but a known threat that could be managed through revised doctrine and improved tactics. The epilogue of the Long Lance story extended beyond the Pacific War into the post-war period, when American naval architects studied captured Japanese technology and incorporated lessons into the development of new weapons systems. The specific challenge of creating an oxygen-propelled torpedo comparable to the Type 93 was never fully pursued, because by war's end, American strategic priorities had shifted toward nuclear weapons and guided missiles, technologies that offered revolutionary capabilities beyond incremental improvements to conventional torpedoes. But the broader lesson of the Long Lance, the recognition that enemies could achieve technical excellence and that American superiority was not inevitable or automatic, did penetrate post-war military culture to some degree. The Cold War confrontation with the Soviet Union forced sustained attention to enemy capabilities and realistic threat assessment. Soviet tank design, Soviet air defense systems, Soviet submarine quieting technologies all demanded respect and drove American weapons development in ways that prevented the kind of complacency that had characterized pre-war torpedo programs. The intelligence failures and institutional complacency that allowed the Long Lance to surprise American commanders became case studies in military education, examples of what happened when assumptions replaced analysis and when comfortable narratives displaced rigorous assessment. Morrison himself, after retiring from active duty in 1952, taught at the Naval War College, where he used the Long Lance as a central example in courses on tactical innovation and institutional learning. The torpedo that had shocked him in that sweltering dry dock in 1943 became a teaching tool, its lessons transmitted to new generations of officers who would face their own challenges and adversaries. But memory is imperfect and institutional learning fragile. The specific details of the long lance faded as veterans retired and new technologies displaced old concerns. By the 1960s, the Type 93 torpedo was a historical curiosity, an interesting footnote in books about Pacific naval warfare, but no longer a living presence in American naval consciousness. The cross-section Morrison had preserved at Pacific Fleet headquarters was eventually moved to a museum, where it sat beside other artifacts from a vanished era, its symbolic weight diminished by distance and forgetfulness. New generations of naval officers studied different technologies and faced different threats, and the specific lesson of the long lance, that enemies could achieve breakthrough innovations while American experts dismissed such achievements as impossible, had to be relearned through new failures and new shocks. Yet the pattern established by the long lance repeated itself in various forms throughout the Cold War and beyond. Soviet advances in submarine acoustics surprised American naval intelligence in the 1970s. Chinese anti-ship ballistic missiles represented capabilities American planners had not anticipated in the 2000s. Iranian drone swarms demonstrated asymmetric threats that conventional doctrine struggled to counter in the 2010s. Each new surprise followed the familiar template. Initial dismissal of enemy capability, accumulation of contradictory evidence, eventual recognition and adaptation, followed by gradual return to comfortable assumptions about American superiority until the next shock forced renewed humility. The cycle suggested that institutional learning was always incomplete, always vulnerable to erosion by time and complacency, always requiring new generations to rediscover lessons their predecessors had learned at terrible cost. Morrison died in 1977, an old man whose career had spanned the transition from battleships to nuclear submarines, from sail-guided torpedoes to intercontinental ballistic missiles. He had watched the Navy change beyond recognition, had seen the enemy he fought become an ally while new adversaries emerged, had lived long enough to witness some of the same institutional patterns he had confronted in 1943 reasserting themselves in new contexts. But he had also seen the torpedo analysis he commissioned save lives, had watched tactical doctrines evolve to account for Japanese capabilities, had known that his work examining that salvaged long lance in the sweltering dry dock had contributed something valuable to the war effort and to institutional memory. That knowledge was sufficient. Not redemption for the sailors lost to weapons no one understood, but a modest achievement in the vast machinery of war and remembrance. The long lance itself, the physical weapon Morrison examined, eventually found its way to the Smithsonian Institution, where it was displayed in the Naval Warfare section alongside other artifacts from the Pacific Campaign. Museum visitors passed by it regularly, some pausing to read the placard explaining its significance, most moving on without particular interest. Few understood what the torpedo represented, what shock it had delivered to American naval confidence, what lessons it embodied about complacency and respect for enemy capability. It was just another relic, interesting perhaps, but inert. Its symbolic weight legible only to those who knew the full story, who understood how this elegantly engineered weapon had forced a reckoning with uncomfortable truths. But for those who did understand, for the diminishing number of veterans who had survived long lance attacks or who had studied the weapon's implications, the torpedo retained its power to teach and chasten. It stood as permanent testimony that wars were not won through righteousness alone, that material abundance was insufficient without intellectual rigor, that enemies deserved respect even as they were opposed. These lessons were unfashionable in a culture that preferred straightforward narratives of heroism and triumph, that resisted ambiguity and complication. But they were true lessons nonetheless, written in the steel and mathematics of a weapon that should not have existed according to American assumptions, that forced recognition of capabilities American planners had declared impossible, that killed American sailors because institutional complacency had prevented adequate threat assessment and tactical adaptation. The freedom and abundance that America defended during the Second World War were real and worth defending, were moral achievements that distinguished democratic societies from totalitarian alternatives. But freedom and abundance did not automatically produce superior technology or guarantee military victory. Those required sustained effort and intellectual humility, required willingness to learn from enemies and adapt to changing circumstances, required institutional cultures that valued accurate assessment over comfortable reassurance. The long-lance torpedo was a teacher of these truths, harsh and unforgiving, its lessons purchased through blood and loss. And though the specific weapon faded into historical memory, though newer technologies displaced torpedo warfare and new threats demanded attention, the essential lesson remained relevant across time and context. Respect your enemy's capability, question comfortable assumptions, and remember that wars are won through rigorous analysis and sustained adaptation rather than faith in inevitable superiority. The symbolic object that carried through this narrative, the Type 93 long-lance torpedo, represented more than Japanese engineering excellence or American institutional failure. It represented the perpetual tension between confidence and humility, between the necessary belief in one's own cause and the equally necessary recognition that enemies possess capabilities deserving respect. That tension could never be fully resolved, could only be managed through constant vigilance and institutional discipline, through cultures that encouraged critical analysis and punished complacency. Morrison understood this in the dry dock in 1943, felt it with visceral immediacy as he examined the weapon that contradicted everything he had been taught about American superiority. And in that moment of recognition, in that shock of learning, lay the foundation for adaptation and eventual victory, purchased not through inevitable triumph, but through hard-won understanding and costly correction of institutional failures. The afternoon in the dry dock ended as all afternoons must, with the work lights dimming and officers dispersing to their duties, with the torpedo remaining on its sawhorses, awaiting further examination and analysis. But the shock of that afternoon rippled outward through months and years, through tactical revisions and doctrinal changes, through quiet conversations in wardrooms and classrooms, where officers tried to articulate what it meant that the enemy had achieved what American experts declared impossible. And in those ripples, in that slow transformation of understanding, lay the only redemption available for the sailors lost to weapons no one understood, the only tribute adequate to their sacrifice, the determination that their deaths would teach lessons, would force humility and respect, would ensure that future American sailors fought with eyes open and assumptions tested against the hard reality of enemy capability. The war would continue for 2 more years after Morrison examined that torpedo, would consume more lives and treasure, would end finally in mushroom clouds over Japanese cities and surrender signed on a battleship's deck. American industrial might would prove decisive, as the triumphalist narratives always insisted, would overwhelm enemy forces through sheer accumulation of ships and planes and bombs. But victory was never inevitable, never guaranteed by righteousness or abundance alone, never achieved without cost and adaptation and learning from mistakes written in blood. The long-lance torpedo stood as permanent witness to these truths, silent testimony to the price of complacency and the necessity of respect. And in that testimony lay something valuable, something worth preserving beyond the immediate context of the Pacific War, something that spoke to the permanent challenge of maintaining institutional humility in the face of enemy capability and cultural arrogance. The torpedo was teacher and memorial both, elegant and deadly, demanding recognition that wars are won not through faith in superiority, but through rigorous assessment of reality and willingness to adapt when reality contradicts comfortable assumptions. That lesson, hard-won in the dry dock's stifling heat, remained true across time and circumstance, waiting to be learned and relearned by each generation that faced the ancient challenge of matching capability against adversary.